In our previous Datum Line broadcast entitled Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit, Part 34, we opened with a few popular but faulty presuppositions to which my generation had been exposed early in life, altering our perception of the world so that we could more easily embrace a lie. First on my list was a false premise that communism, socialism, and fascism were the enemies of 20th century America, being unaware that we would inherit a socialist, centrally planned and regulated credit system of corporate monopolies that bore little resemblance to free enterprise posited on lawful money, traceable all the way back to the book of Genesis and authorized by our federal and state constitutions. America's economy was defined by an abundance of small, independent mom and pop enterprises nurtured by tangible investment capital derived from family and other local sources. But that was prior to the baby boom of the 19th century. Oh, did you miss that one? Well, maybe it's because those babies were artificial persons, also known as corporations, which gained the preeminence by tapping into vast reservoirs of credit created out of nothing by the godmen of investment banking. You know, when AOL, America Online, later acquired Time Warner Communication, that was back in 2000, they closed the deal at $160 billion. Small potatoes, you say. But if we borrowed $1,000 every day of the week, it would require 2,740 years to obtain just $1 billion of what the Federal Reserve System creates in the wink of an eye. Time Warner cost AOL $160,000 times 365, the number of days in a year, times 2,740, the number of years to reach 160 billion. And to think that every dollar in the entire economy is created by and borrowed from a bank in the Federal Reserve System at interest. Oh, next on my list of false paradigms was the one about Republicans versus Democrats. Not that there wasn't a difference back in the 1830s, but a lot of bank credit has lubricated the sin-laden machinery of two-party politics since General Jackson occupied the White House. A staunch opponent of central banking, Jackson was seen as a champion of the common man. That image of a Democrat is still believed 180 years later. Democrats are for the people, most of whom no longer understand or share Jackson's hatred for a central bank, which may explain why Democrats have not let us out of the swamp called the Federal Reserve System and the federal income tax. Both would have been anathema to Jackson, and both were established under President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat. And why have Democrats not rejected the New Deal programs of Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Well, it's because Democrats love socialism and FDR, another Democrat. One of his advisors, Rexford Guy Tugwell, drafted the new state's constitution to replace the Constitution of 1787. Wasn't that thoughtful of him? I mention Tugwell because his proposal replaced our constitutional monetary system of gold and silver with legal tender to conceal what the Federal Reserve System and FDR had actually done. And they didn't even seek to amend the Constitution, let alone write a new one. The former House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, should have indicted FDR and their fellow congressmen, Democrats and Republicans, for their un-American activities in creating a bank monopoly that confiscated our gold and silver. An un-American activity, by the way, was an attempt to alter our political economy by circumventing the constitutional amendment process. That's what an un-American activity is. As for Tugwell and his legal tender, it's not just Republicans and Democrats who embrace the Communist Manifesto's fifth plank, or all 10 of them. As Alabama Governor George Wallace said, there's not a dime's worth of difference between them. Number 3 on my list was a fanciful story created during the shadowboxing contest known as the Cold War. This involved the free world versus communist world, renamed liberal democracy versus despotic centralism from what I see in a recent Wall Street Journal. With America tightening its grip on all 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto, however, our listeners are probably wondering when their neighbors will finally realize that there's not a dime's worth of difference between them. You see, Russia now appears to be more free than the USSR, and our rising police state is becoming as brutal as that of Communist China. It's an ever-shifting landscape. What a pity that so many Americans refuse to face reality and will flatly deny that the person they see in the mirror had anything to do with it. Now, if this seems off the wall to you, then pick up a copy of the Communist Manifesto from your library or bookstore and just read the enumerated 10 planks for yourself. The rest of the book is a waste of time. The second plank, the income tax, and fifth plank, central bank, were implemented here in the United States in 1913. That's 100 years ago. The first plank, property tax, goes back a few decades before that. Our 10th plank, government school system, predates the others, while a more recent and progressive 8th plank, that's equal liability of all to labor, was hailed as a great victory for women's liberation. A woman can now make her very own house, car, and college tuition payments by joining the socialist workers' paradise instead of governing the home front on behalf of her husband. According to Cosmopolitan magazine, source of all wisdom and truth, life as a concubine is the ultimate experience before growing old. After that, Uncle Sam moves in as the last great sugar daddy. The enemy delights in irrelevant debates to keep us distracted so we never find the truth. For example, liberal politicians want to spend more of your tax money for social programs. Their conservative cousins urge them to spend more responsibly. But the real truth is that we've had no money to spend for nearly 50 years. A political hydra, known as the Israel Lobby, demands more economic aid for Israel, most of it in the form of military assistance. Critics of America's biased foreign policy in the Mideast protest our support of the racist Marxist state of Israel. The truth, quietly admitted by Israeli intellectuals, is that 90% or more of those people over there are not descendants of Shem, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob Israel. They're not Semitic, and they're not Israelites, meaning neither they nor their ancestors ever had a claim to that land. But truth is never at issue, is it? After touching briefly on the aforementioned paradigms, we then connected a few dots to link East and West Bloc bank credit to a global government funded by the transnational monetization of debt. Everybody's doing it, both free and slave, so what's the big deal? We then closed with a brief reply to a challenge that appeared in American Free Press, issue number 30, July 29, 2013, in which our federal Constitution was identified as the cause of our national woes. The title, Constitution Unable to Rein in Big Government, by Kenneth W. Royce. His underlying premise, the Constitution was conceived, planned, debated, ratified, and executed with the goal of relentless, unstoppable federal expansion at the expense of the states, the people, and freedom in general. End quote. Now, that was quite a challenge. And we're going to address that challenge again in today's broadcast to kind of wind it up. We could probably spend a lot more time in it, but I don't want to get too far afield from economic myths, because that's what we're dealing with. In fact, this actually does introduce, I believe, another economic myth. Today's message is entitled Economic Myths and the Science of Deceit. This is going to be part 35. And before we went on the air this morning, my wife and I were talking about the mythological world in which we both grew up, having been subjected to the ether of academia and media. Not on all subjects, you understand, but in the realm of the political. And it reminded me of a little story, and I wanted to share it with you to illustrate the political acumen of a young teenager back around 1960. He was a neighbor of mine. He was a year older than me. I think he was about 14. And I figured surely he could dispel my confusion. See, I had recently discovered through a politically conservative newsletter to which my parents subscribed that the United States was a republic. In fact, it even had a slogan, and I had spray painted a few public surfaces, if you will, with this slogan to show my political acumen. Now, that slogan, some of you might remember it. This is a republic, not a democracy. Let's keep it that way. Well, newsletters can be so inspiring for young people. And this was during the Cold War, you see, and we needed all the inspiration we could get in the fight against communism, the focal point of which lay behind the Iron Curtain, a country called the Soviet Union. But this was to provide me with a deepening sense of bewilderment when I discovered what was meant by the letters USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. But I thought we were a republic. Imagine my consternation when I learned that a big communist country in Asia was called the People's Republic of China, and that all of the rising and falling dictatorships of South America were called banana republics. So I had to know for sure what kind of a country I lived in, and who better to straighten me out in this confusing adult world than a 14-year-old who I knew could be trusted. Hey, Stephen, is the United States a republic or a democracy? Well, he frowned and he thought for a moment, and doing that always made his responses seem so much more credible. And he then said, when the Republicans are in office, it's a republic. And when the Democrats win the election, it's a democracy. I'll be real. How could anyone find fault with such clear-sighted wisdom as that? But then I read the Constitution, which says at Article 4, Section 4, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government, which, according to Stephen, must mean that the Republicans are supposed to win every election, or at least every state election. So then you wonder, well, why should we even be holding elections? Well, then I read the Wall Street Journal, and that was just recently. That was for the Saturday, Sunday, October 26 and 27, 2013 issue. Section C, page 1. The article was entitled, China's Coming Slow Down. I mentioned it in the last broadcast. And this was written by Joseph Joffe. And I wanted to find out, I want to get the latest update on political truth. Here's what Joffe says, quote, who is on the right side of history? Is it liberal democracy, with power growing from the bottom up, hedged in by free markets, the rule of law, accountability, and separation of powers? Gee, doesn't he sound a little bit like Ron Paul? Or, he says, is it despotic centralism in the way of Stalin and Hitler? The most recent, though far less cruel, variant being the Chinese one, state capitalism plus one-party rule. State capitalism? I need an Alka-Seltzer. Well, anyway, I thought you might find that of interest. As I mentioned on the other side of this first break, there was an article in the American Free Press back in July. The article is entitled Constitution Unable to Rein in Big Government. Well, how are we supposed to arrive at this conclusion on short notice? Well, the author says that circumstantial historical evidence clearly supports his premise, which is manifest by the observable fact that, he says, federal expansion and intrusion is subject to no real practical enforceable constitutional limits. Now, on its face, this appears to be so, but outward appearances can be deceiving. If, however, appearances reflect the truth about the Constitution and the diabolical intent behind it, then everything positive and worthwhile that we've been told about the Constitution and our founding fathers by flag-waving patriots, historians like George Bancroft, and proponents of constitutional law like Professor Edwin Vieira, is a sick joke designed to keep us in the dark. And wouldn't you know, this depressing revelation comes at a time when the Bible, Jesus Christ, and our traditional Christian values are under the most vicious assault since the founding of our republic. Or is it a democracy? It depends. Joffe says it's a democracy, I guess. But maybe this was intended as well. So I'll try not to answer a matter before hearing it, limiting my comments only to what has been revealed thus far. Now, thus far, American Free Press, formerly the Spotlight, gives absolute credence to the idea that our constitutional forefathers authorized Congress to create money out of nothing. Wow. Like so many other populists, they're champing at the bit, awaiting the day when Congress nationalizes the privately owned Federal Reserve and finally begins to create this money in the oxymoronic tradition of non-promissory U.S. notes, while ignoring the fact that the Constitution never authorized any such thing. Even gold and silver certificates, 100% redeemable, are unconstitutional. But rather than correct me if I'm wrong, they have found a way to ignore the Constitution altogether. It's now the source of our national calamity and not the solution they once claimed. How convenient. Meanwhile, I'd like to ask a favor of my listeners who may have jumped on the anti-constitutional bandwagon that's now touring the country. Please, before asking me to review any of this material for purpose of comment, please condense and simplify what I'm supposed to review. On average, I spend probably 24 hours assembling, condensing, editing, simplifying, and otherwise producing each Datum Line message for your consideration. After that, I have lots of chores to do, so if you could ease my burden, I would be ever so grateful. As King Solomon said, the writing of many books is endless and a weariness of the flesh. Now, some of you may be wondering how we ever got onto the subject of broad-based constitutional intent, which at first blush might not seem pertinent or relevant to our present Datum Line series regarding economic myths. Well, again, Kenneth Royce, and now American Free Press, asked someone to show any definitive evidence disproving his premise that federal expansion is subject to no meaningful constitutional limitations, and that this lack of protection was planned, debated, and ratified from the beginning. Okay? Now, to deny that tyrants can be found in every generation or to ignore their possible presence in colonial America would be foolish. But to accuse the delegates en masse at the Philadelphia Convention of deliberately fomenting a plan for runaway federal expansion is a challenge that I felt compelled to answer. This particularly since a wonderful impediment to federal expansion is being ignored by folks who are either brain dead or working for an unelected invisible government of despotic oppressors. Be that as it may, AFP gave space to an article by Mr. Royce and promoted his book, which they offer as, quote-unquote, must-reading, in which our founding fathers are cast in a shameful light while simultaneously ignoring the most important and obvious protection, at least that I see, that they put in the Constitution to restrain despotic government. In fact, AFP doesn't just ignore this marvel of restraint, they twist it into a pretzel so as to justify their goal of nationalizing the Federal Reserve pursuant to the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto. Now, as absurd as this may sound, I'm not making it up. So what is it about the powers not delegated in the 10th Amendment that they do not understand? You know, over the last 30 or more years, I've heard and read quite a few opinions as to what various people believe are the protections we have against federal tyranny. They're generally found in the Bill of Rights and referred to as the right to keep and bear arms, the right to a trial by jury, and so on. Now, those are significant protections, to be sure. But I'd again ask you to please consider the most significant safeguard against federal tyranny, which was not an amended or an amendment added to the Constitution as an afterthought, but was here from the beginning, hammered out in the original debates. It was the prohibition against bills of credit, what the constitutional delegates referred to as paper money, or what I simply call the power of government to legally steal what you produce. So here's my challenge. Identify a tyrannical power that will surpass the creation of money out of nothing, which government then compels citizens to accept as payment for goods and services. And I'll join your crusade for liberty and truth. The Constitution withstood this unwarranted exercise of power for over 70 years, until Congress issued its first legal tender notes under President Lincoln. But wouldn't you know, populist monetary reformers hold to the opinion that Lincoln was the first president to unleash the power, the constitutional power, of money creation, and that this was what our founding fathers actually intended. In so doing, they turned the English language on its head, authoritatively telling their listeners what is not so. But we're just supposed to ignore this and jump to the next topic, carried about in their anti-constitutional bandwagon. Well, so how was it that the Constitution was able to restrain Congress from emitting bills of credit for over 70 years, when constitutional critics have now determined that the same document is incapable of restraining a lawless government? May I suggest that a contract, a covenant, or a constitution is no better than the people who are subject to its provisions. Marriage vows do not a faithful marriage make. A statesman, in my view, is one who will honor his oath of office. A politician, on the other hand, will set us aside and would sell us out for pennies on a dollar. America's early statesmen represented a predominantly self-respecting and independent people whose moral integrity withstood the temptation of privileges and benefits that precede or accompany the exercise of despotic power. Is this so difficult to understand? Thomas Jefferson said that big government, or a government big enough to supply everything you need, is big enough to take everything you have. What a deceiving politician conceals beneath rhetoric piled high, Jefferson revealed in one easy-to-understand sentence. Now that demonstrates a quality now all but extinct: wisdom. Others were not far behind in their ability to convey a message. One of them exempted his faint-hearted countrymen from the coming battle with British regulars, who were beholden to a despotic King George, saying, "If ye love wealth greater than liberty, the tranquility of servitude greater than the animating contest of freedom, go home from us in peace. We seek not your counsel, nor your arms. Crouch down and lick the hand that feeds you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen." So said Samuel Adams. Now, when our ancient forefathers drew nigh to the battle, the priests ordered their officers to say unto them, in part, "What man is there that is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go and return unto his house, lest his brethren's heart faint as well as his heart." Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 8. Does this sound so different from what Sam Adams said in his day? There's an economic myth in the making, one that denies the presence of a constitutional limitation sufficient to resist unwarranted federal expansion, and that this was an intentional omission by our forefathers. I believe that a superlative limitation was there all along, however, that it's been grossly misunderstood and underestimated and is being ignored by defenders of liberty, that's what they say they are, who leave this topic to their favorite experts, who seem to generally fall into one of two possible schools of thought. One, they're either outright advocates of the Communist Manifesto's fifth plank, or two, they're believers in a prudent level of organized theft perpetrated either by bankers, Congress, or both. Look closely. You'll see that the Constitution does not permit gold or silver certificates. Neither does it provide for United States notes, even if they're redeemable at par, dollar weight for dollar weight. This is a bulwark against oppression that finds very few people willing to stand behind it. As the comic strip crocodile named Pogo said so long ago, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." Several decades ago, the Vice President of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia put those same sentiments, but to a different tune. His name was Lawrence C. Murdoch, Jr. Here's what he said. A politician is addressing the home folks. For the first 15 minutes, he extols states' rights, and the crowd cheers. For the second 15 minutes, he tells how he's going to fight for an increase in government subsidies. We call those grants. And the crowd cheers just as enthusiastically. The speaker and his constituents are good examples of the split vision is double-mindedness, with which Americans view government. In principle, in other words, in word, but not in deed, in principle, many of us are against the extension of federal influence and control. But in practice, we turn right around and apply for every governmental benefit that happens to be available. End quote. Where did he say that? In a publication called Big Government, published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. This appears on page 1. This was printed around 1980. Now, does it seem strange to our regular listeners that the vice president of a Federal Reserve Bank would write about the subject of big government? Not at all. Banking and government are linked together like a marriage made in heaven, or in hell, if yours is a Christian worldview. As the Apostle Paul said to Timothy, the love of money is the root of all evil. But what he didn't say was that in our generation, our pursuit of material gain, we would love credit even more than money. The first legal tender of United States notes appeared in 1861. Now, that was 74 years after the Constitution was written. The first gold certificates didn't appear until 1863, 2 years later. That's 76 years after the Constitution was written. The first silver certificates appeared 15 years after that in 1878. That's 91 years after the Constitution was written. If Congress had the power to issue legal tender IOUs, and that's what those all were, from the beginning, why did they wait so long to print one? Because it was unconstitutional, and had to wait for an emergency to excuse their usurpation of a power that we, the people, never gave them. Those powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, says the 10th Amendment, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So how can it be said that the Constitution fails to limit lawless federal expansion? Did the states reserve to themselves the power to emit bills of credit? No. The states denied to themselves this power when their own delegates formulated the prohibition in Article 1, Section 10 and Paragraph 1 of the Constitution, which the states then ratified after the Constitutional Convention, in voluntary submission thereto. Would they have done the same if represented by the kind of politicians we now send to Washington? No. We, the people, were free to conduct our economic affairs in lawful money, gold and silver, the trading of labor and commodities, that's called barter, or even with personal and business credit instruments, so long as their terms and conditions of contract were properly met. However, did we, the people, reserve to ourselves the authority to emit bills of credit payable in nothing, with the power to compel their acceptance by legislative decree? Not at all. For this would have been theft perpetrated under the color of law. If, in the sight of God, we, the people, are without the power to steal, then we cannot delegate that unlawful power to government so that it may steal on our behalf or in our collective name. Why is this so difficult to understand? Several possibilities come to mind. Some of the people who inhabit the American landscape are spiritually inert, not having the law of God written on their hearts, unable to discern good and evil, or the consequences thereof. Clouds without water, walking after their own lust, followers of corrupt men in high places from whom they beg favors. 2, others have surrendered to the cares of this world or to willful disobedience. They feed freely from the federal trough and lobby Congress for more entitlements which do not exist under biblical common law. 3, others are blinded by the spirit of confusion sown by media, modern education, and global ecumenical hybridized religion designed to offend no one except God. Herein is the failure, not of our constitutional form of government so much as we, the people, who are responsible to preserve it. You know, the Constitution created, ostensibly, a righteous government and free economy. Now, I know a lot of people disagree with that, but any deficiencies or shortcomings were to be corrected by the amendment process. There was a provision for changing if you didn't like it. But there was no earthly subject more important to the preservation of our political economy than a monetary system conforming to the will of God. Consider the words of our second president, a man who believed it was his duty to read the Bible from cover to cover every year. Here's what he said. All of the perplexities, confusions, and distresses in America arise not from defects in the Constitution or Confederation, not from want of honor or virtue, as much as from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. John Adams. Our colonial preachers who ignited the spirit of resistance to British tyranny would have understood this. But modern theology is taught from tax-exempt pulpits as drinking from another cup and another spirit. Their God is neutral on political and economic issues. so are they. And this neutrality just happens to coincide with their express obligation of contract, found at Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, which says in part, exempting or exemption from tax on corporations for religious purposes, no substantial part of the activities of which is carrying on propaganda, attempting to influence legislation, or participate in any political campaign. But a non-corporate church, on the other hand, as opposed to a corporation, could do any and all of those things. Well, but hold on, you say. IRS only prohibits a substantial amount of propaganda. But our pastor doesn't spread any propaganda. He just loves the Lord and preaches the gospel of Jesus Christ. Am I misrepresenting the reality of America's mainstream religion? These are the sentiments of a congregation without a biblical compass, one that surrendered the earthly dominion mandate to Satan, or maybe I should say to Caesar. Propaganda is a word not found in the American Dictionary of the English Language by Noah Webster, published in 1828. However, we do find the words propagandist and propagandism, both of which simply refer to the spread of ideas, principles, or tenets. Not one evil connotation is even suggested. Do you, your priest or pastor, spread ideas, principles, or tenets? I would certainly hope so. After all, isn't that what religion is all about? Yet the word propaganda has taken on a decidedly negative flavor, and rather quickly. The word appears in the New World Dictionary, Webster, again, 1966, definition number 1. In the Roman Catholic Church, a committee of cardinals, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, in charge of the foreign missions. Hence, 2, any organization or movement working for the propagation of particular ideas, doctrines, practices, etc. Is there anything wrong with doing that? Number 3, the ideas, doctrines, practices, etc. spread in this way. So far, so good. Number 4, any systematic, widespread, deliberate indoctrination or plan for such indoctrination, now often used in a derogatory sense, connoting deception or distortion. Indoctrination. Is that a bad word? Oh, indoctrination is simply instruction in doctrines, principles, theories, or beliefs. Is there anything wrong with this? Of course not. But try telling people today that you indoctrinate your children through the use of propaganda, and they'll probably notify a government agency to take away your children. Why should IRS care if your religious organization is spreading ideas, principles, and tenets, when that's precisely what religion is all about? What legally binding definition do they affix to the word propaganda? Or does their definition change with the wind so as to entrap anyone who Caesar deems to be an enemy of the state? Why would Caesar want to prohibit your endorsement of political candidates who embrace your beliefs when government schools openly assault the very essence of Christian civilization, the appalling and disintegrating result of which is all around us? The answer, obvious. A non-corporate church is unobstructed by the terms and conditions of contract, being free to propagate the moral tenets of Scripture, to condemn evil, to endorse candidates for public office who will do likewise. Furthermore, a church does not subject itself to audit for the purpose of establishing compliance with principles that violate those of her Creator, Jesus Christ. On the other hand, corporate status is sought for the state-created benefit of limited liability, limited responsibility. As a creature of government, the state, a corporation is subject to whatever rules are imposed by its creator, who, as another artificial person, is often personified by clergy and laity alike as Caesar. How ironic. The Internal Revenue Service Handbook for Special Agents says in Section 342.31, the state, having created the corporation, has reserved the power to inquire into its activities. That's a sovereign power, by the way, just like we the people, reserved powers that we didn't give to government. Now, they, IRS, rely upon 2 Supreme Court decisions, Wilson versus United States and Hale versus Henkel. Churches are an important aspect of America's constitutional system of checks and balances, being composed of we the people, who can respond to government abuse either individually or as a unified body of believers in righteous government. In an earlier broadcast, we drew upon Professor of Law Edwin Vieira in Pieces of 8, Volume 1, where he identified not 3 branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, but 5. The 2 we tend to overlook are the states, number 4, and we the people, number 5. Both states and we the people can exert an influence against federal abuse in various ways, but trying to stop a runaway government clothed with the power to steal has been futile. Thomas Jefferson perceived the effects of this and had the wisdom to declare its cause 200 years ago. In a single sentence, so typical of Jefferson, he answered the challenge of those who now believe the Constitution is powerless. He says, when all government, in little as in great things, shall be drawn to Washington as the center of all power, it will render powerless the checks provided of one government on another, and will become as venal and oppressive as the government from which we separated. End quote. Well, wouldn't you know? We're there. And few there be who can explain how we got here. I submit that it's the power to steal the productive energy created by what was once the most powerful economic engine on earth, that has concentrated all political power in Washington, whereby our constitutional checks and balances were effectively erased. The reason for this is that no one wants to suffer any economic privations for resisting federal encroachment. When to remain silent, or better yet, play ball with the godmen on the Potomac, preserves the free flow of federal grants, military contracts, and welfare entitlements, upon which a once free and independent people have become so dependent. In the words of Samuel Adams, our citizens will lick the hand that feeds them. That's not the way it was prior to the Federal Reserve System. It's not what the Constitution mandates, and I doubt that it was intended. But it's certainly the system we've all played a part in creating or supporting. All of us have given our strength to the Babylonian harlot whose imaginary credit, has turned godly behavior and common sense upside down. Our first problem is looking at us from the mirror. Americans, as Mr. Murdoch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia said, are double-minded. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, said to the 12 tribes of Israel that a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. James 1, verse 1 and 8. Good results, righteous results, do not proceed from evil. And our founding fathers knew the evils of so-called paper money, which the friends of credit promote at American Free Press. Jefferson is quoted on both sides of this issue, with each claiming him as their spokesman, either on behalf of lawful money, gold, and silver, or bills of credit. He said, the federal government, I deny their power to make paper money a legal tender. End quote. Where did he say this? Jefferson's Works, Volume 4, page 260. This was quoted by George Bancroft, the historian, in a plea for the Constitution, which he wrote in 1886, and it appeared on page 88. It was reprinted in 1982. Okay? We are the problem. Now, you can blame the Constitution if you want to, and I'm not saying the Constitution doesn't have any deficiencies. But if it did, or if it does, it was our responsibility to amend it. But we didn't bother. We just simply bulldoze around it, or let the public officials do it on our behalf, as we begged for more and more grants, privileges, emoluments, benefits, subsidies. Look in the mirror, America.